The 6 to 7 Figure Show, episode 58. Let's hit it.
Broadcasting from the Valley of the Sun outside Phoenix, Arizona. This is the 6 to 7 Figure Show. Tired of working so hard and having no time? Take your six-figure practice and turn it to a thriving seven-figure enterprise. And now, your host, author, speaker, mentor, and strategist, Frank Bria.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 6 to 7 Figure Show. I'm your host, Frank Bria, and today, absolutely thrilled to be joined by my good guest, Mieka Forte. She's the author of the recently published book, The Many Sides of Happy. She works with leaders and corporations implementing strategies for a more positive, productive, and successful work environment. She also coaches people one-on-one, helping them to overcome adversities and challenges in their life, fostering more happiness and success. She's a wife, mom of two boys, two dogs, and a cat. And we absolutely welcome you to the show, Mieka. How you doing?
Doing great. So happy to be here. Thanks so much, Frank.
Yeah, absolutely happy to have you here. We don't often get the cat and dog. It's usually a one or the other. So absolutely thrilled. So tell us about Many Sides of Happy. What's the focus of the book? Who is that directed at?
Okay, so the focus of the book is more from an individual perspective. And saying that, I have actually walked groups through lots of different workshops in the past that all informed what went into this book.
Okay.
And the title, The Many Sides of Happy, came from my work. Sort of evolves around how do people foster more happiness in their lives. And it's really interesting because research is showing that we're actually on a decline. So even though a lot of us have more access and opportunity, there's actually a paradoxical decline in happiness. And research also shows that it's not success that breeds happiness, but happiness actually breeds success. And the thing that I've sort of learned around happiness is that it tends to be considered kind of a fluffy topic, and it's actually not. And when you're doing happiness work in itself, it's actually a lot of hard work. I also work in mental health. And so what I want to be careful to qualify before we sort of get further into this discussion is that when I talk about fostering and choosing more happiness into your life and using that as a success strategy, I'm not implying that you are dismissing a specific mental health issue that may exist. What's interesting is Martin Seligman, who's actually the grandfather of positive psychology, or he's considered one of the sort of forefathers of the research. He talks about that you can actually have a mental health issue and flourish, or you can actually not have a mental health issue and also languish. And so it's really important to understand that even though this work is happening in happiness, we're not implying, or I'm not implying, that a mental health issue doesn't exist or that that's not another obstacle.
Right.
Where the idea of the many sides of happy came from is this awareness that sometimes to understand what really happiness means to us, we actually have to sit on a completely different side of it. And so we have to sometimes sit in anger. We have to sometimes sit in stress. We have to sometimes sit, in grief. And what can come from that when we sort of give ourselves the permission to be real is this understanding of ourselves, and in turn, this ability to actually reconnect with happiness. And when we do that, and when we actually find sort of that space of what happiness means to us and how we can really foster that in our lives, we open up portals to creativity, to problem solving. Research shows less sick days at work. It shows from sales that people actually land the sale more successfully when they're in a positive mindset. And so it's really important work.
Yeah. And it's fascinating that you draw this distinction between mental health issues and happiness, almost like there's a completely disconnected 2x2 kind of matrix of possibilities where I know a lot of people feel like, okay, well, they've got anxiety, depression, and therefore they feel weighed down by this. There's have research that basically shows, listen, not like you don't have to deal with that, but it doesn't have to affect your positivity and happiness going forward, that there's a way to kind of move through it. That's got to be a refreshing message for a lot of people who might have felt like because they're dealing with a mental health issue, like this was set in stone for them and they were going to fight against this their whole lives.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. And I'm doing my master's right now in counseling and psychology because I wanted to understand. I've done heaps of research from a positive psychology perspective. Positive psychology is actually really new in the world of psychology. It's not that old in comparison to the psychology that was focused more on what's wrong. And so I wanted to make sure that I had an awareness of not just one perspective and one lens. I'm also a yoga instructor. And so I have the perspective of what yoga teaches us around mental health and healing as well. And so I went in to do my master's to really recognize, okay, what did traditional psychology sort of teach around this? And there was a point where it was about survival. So it was just, if you're struggling with anxiety or depression or whatever it might be, let's just get you to like sort of this baseline versus this, let's move beyond that. And how do you actually thrive while you might be struggling with anxiety or depression? I keep using those two just because they're popular, even,
Sure.
And I don't want to dismiss that so many other mental health issues exist.
Right.
And so when someone is trying to be a successful entrepreneur or is in the corporate world and they're dealing with mental health issues, when you actually start to bring in happiness strategies, they can become coping tools. And it gives people the ability to know that their head can come above water. Instead of, when someone's dealing with anxiety, depression, it can really push them against the wall and they can feel like there is no opportunity. There's nothing. And so I actually interviewed a child psychiatrist when I was writing my book. And she was like, Mieka, even if someone needs to go on medication, the medication, it behaves as the armor. But still the other work that you can do in terms of happiness or in the realm of positive psychology, this is what's going to actually give people the tools and the abilities to thrive and succeed. And so I like to sort of language it that I operate in the world of and.
That's interesting. I've got to imagine that for those people who are struggling at that baseline, to get above that baseline, whether or not they've worked really hard to get to baseline, getting above that seems kind of formidable. I mean, there does seem to be a lot of content or I guess, for lack of a better term, sort of motivational quotes out there around happiness and positive mindset that could feel pretty like overwhelming to people who wake up in the morning and are like, what the heck am I supposed to do with this? How do you implement this? It just feels like there's so many people who at least pretend to be on social media. I don't know if it's always the case, but who have really sort of nailed this quote unquote happiness state. And you point out there is, this science that connects actual results, talking in the entrepreneur world specifically about doing this. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion, at least not that I can see, around processes to get there, steps to get there. Do you have any guidance to share with folks who are saying, this just feels out of reach for me and I don't even know how to begin the process?
Yeah. So it was interesting because when I first got into happiness work, I got a lot of like kickback where it was like, oh yeah, Mieka, everything's sunshine, rainbows and unicorns and da da da. And I was like, ouch, like why is everybody so angry with happiness? And so I had a real blind spot in terms of how it could feel so astronomically overwhelming when you're in that state of struggle. Even though for me, my personal story is also kind of weaved into this book where I discovered happiness from a really, really dark place. And, it's not to imply that it's not, I think these quotes are out there to imply that it's possible. However, you're so right that sometimes you're going to look at these quotes and think like, I can't just undo how I feel. I can't undo this like massive, weight that's on my chest right now. So in the book, I talk a lot about processes. And so it's broken up into 3 sections. The first section, we get into happiness groundwork tools. And these are tools that have empirical evidence behind them. And what I suggest to anyone is pick one. Just pick one of these groundwork tools and work with that tool until you no longer have to think about it, where it becomes more of like an automatic process, because otherwise it gets too overwhelming. And I am sort of a recovering type AAA personality type, and I work with a lot of AAA personality type. I can't remember who, I did not come up with that term. Somebody shared with me and I
I was
adopted
gonna
it, and I
say,
just think
like,
it's hilarious.
I've heard of type A, but type AAA sounds intense.
Right? It's like the people who are like, hey, that's a good idea. That should have been done yesterday, and the expectations are just like through the roof. And so, so if you're that type of personality type, when you see, you're like, oh, I've got like eight groundwork tools. Okay, I need to master all of them. I should have mastered them yesterday, da 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 da, right? And so one of the first things I recommend is you need to approach yourself and where you're at from a place of compassion, but also a place of intentional action. So there's two kind of things happening at the same time. And look at which one feels the most accessible and start with that one, right? And then once that starts to kick in, then you can start to work with the next and so on and so forth. And research tells us that 40% of happiness can be impacted by intentional activity. So that's a big chunk that you can make an impact on. So sometimes it's also through education and just helping to recognize, and educate whoever I'm working with. This is just possible for you as it is for someone else. But we also have to look at what's your individual formula.
Right.
Right?
That's really interesting. It's almost like you're describing this happiness work as you're using the same kind of language that we would use to talk about habit formation. I mean, this intentional action and planning out. I mean, James Clear's Atomic Habits books talks a lot about what it takes to actually install a habit in your life, and you're using a lot of the same language. It's just fascinating that the achievement of happiness is very much similar to the achievement of any other project or thing that people might be doing, where you need to essentially redevelop a set of actions, which is new for you, which and in fact might even be hard for you. I'd be the first person to admit that there have been times in my life where all of the things that people discuss about what it takes to actually install happiness in your life feel really hard. I'm like, I'd rather go to the gym actually than do some of this stuff. Just because it feels like it's not me. It feels sort of counterproductive. So it's fascinating that you're using similar language.
Well, and it needs to be authentic. What's cool is that the gym exercise actually is a massive happiness strategy. So you're still doing one. So that's brilliant. But, and it's there. So there, and that's the language that why I use that language in the corporate world is that language makes sense, right? Like habit forming and that's the conversations that are happening there. When I start to go into a group format, and let's say I'm working with people from the yoga world, we're going to have a different conversation. We're going to go into, and this is where we start to have people explore tools to get to know what is your actual definition of happiness. Because it's so fascinating that I don't know what the statistic is in terms of goal, where people say, my number one goal in life is to be happy, for example, but I know the statistic is really high. And I actually had someone once come up to me and tell me that they actually felt inadequate for happiness, which that whole conversation is in my book because it blew my mind.
Yeah.
But what came out of that was I said to her, okay, why don't you just redefine what happiness means to you? Because basically why she felt this way was what's on TV projected as what's supposed to make you happy. And she's like, I don't want any of that stuff in my life.
Right.
And so when you start to teach people to actually dive in, actually define it for yourself. I usually get crickets in the room. I might have two people if I'm doing a keynote where I'll ask, has anybody in the room defined it? Right? And so you need to know, in any goal setting strategy, you need to know the goal you're working toward. Right? And so in happiness, you need to define what that actually means. What's really powerful and profound that can happen in that moment is that people start to actually unpack that happiness is right there. Like it's literally been sitting right there.
Yeah.
And so it's not, when we start to talk about purpose finding, right? Like we all sort of look at this and like, oh God, this is some like massive universal thing that I need to like understand and unpack and, go and meditate on a mountain in Tibet for like 7 years or something to figure out. And that's not the case. So often once we start to really dive in, you realize that it's there. It's always been there, but we've forgotten, or we've got disconnected, or whatever it might be. Did I lose you? Oh no. Oh, hey. Yeah. So, it's profound when you sort of, and people have lived years not recognizing that their definition and their experience of happiness is actually right there. And it's not going to involve some sort of, huge life event for them to like unveil that, oh, happiness is here. Like it's there because it's in so many different simple things. And when people start to see that, they realize, okay, I can tap into this. And then from an entrepreneurial perspective and a business perspective, you can leverage that feeling and what that experience does from a mental perspective to actually foster creativity, productivity, problem solving. Like there's so many aspects and elements that it feeds into from a success perspective. But yet when you first talk about it, you're like, happiness, what? Right?
In fact, it's funny. Like I was just thinking, like that probably should have been my very first question in this interview is what is happiness? Because it seems so foundational. But actually, now that it's come up and we're talking about multifaceted variants of this, let's pivot a little bit to kind of talking about how you work with people. Because I would imagine one of the things that people might be asking themselves as they're listening to this is, hey, you work in groups, you've got workshops that you hold, things like that. With such a varied definition and with such a unique meaning, how do you get a group of people who might be on very different journeys to work together as a group, or sort of tailor what you do to fit all of these different journeys? That feels like that would be a tougher thing to do.
Yeah. So again, it depends on the environment that I'm working in, right? So if I'm in a corporate environment, I'm not going to go down the deep feeling road, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So, you got to be careful, because the irony is that when you're working in happiness, it surfaces a lot of emotion.
I would imagine.
Some people, and so you need to like dance around that so that you're not busting people so far out of their comfort zones in a corporate environment.
Sure.
So what we look at instead is, how do we look at where you're allocating your time? Where are the stress factors like coming into play? And how can we start to set up systems? How can we start to look at where you might have some blind spots? How do we start to create a culture that is supportive and that, creates a positive environment? Because the emotion contagion effect is real. So you can walk into a room and if people are stressed and angry, it. And the same thing when you walk into a room that's like super high and full of positive vibes, like you're like, where can I drink the friggin' Kool-Aid from this room? Like it's intoxicating, right?
Absolutely.
And so how do you foster that culture in a corporation, right? And so you have to like, first of all, you understand like what is the main goals of the corporation, so that you aren't just like barfing your own culture onto them as to like what positivity should look like. Because again, it's individual, right? And it has to be authentic. If I'm in there saying like, every Friday, everybody's got to come in dressed in a costume and that's going to foster a positive environment, like, no.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a lot of strategy building that way. And again, it comes back to educating. I always bring the groundwork tools in, because if you can give, whether it's leaders or whether it's their employees, tools that they can implement both at work and at home, that's also a retention strategy, because now you have made the employee or the leader feel like the corporation is looking at the person, not just the numbers that person is turning over.
Right. So, yeah. So in a corporate environment, or any environment, I suppose, but particularly in corporate, this is one of those things where, as we talk about program development and with a lot of focus on outcomes. So the obvious question is, happiness doesn't seem like something you arrive at. It doesn't seem like a destination. It feels like the journey. So how do you measure progress or success for folks? How do you say, yep, like we're making progress here, folks are doing better. It's, you know, in such an ethereal thing as how they're feeling, that's got to be one of the questions that your participants also must be asking themselves along the way. Like, is this working for me? How are there, are there any sort of quantitative or even qualitative ways of measuring that people are kind of making progress down that path?
So from a quantitative perspective, excuse me, you start to look at sick days in terms of how often your staff are taking days off. You also look at time and money lost in mental health leave. And so that is a quantitative measure that you can take. From a qualitative perspective, this is where tons of measures, right? So you just like workplace well-being. Yeah. This is huge right now, right? And so there's questions where you, in the beginning, you know, how do you feel showing up to work? Are you excited to show up to work? Is this a workplace that you would recommend for other people that you would want to bring on board? And so you can survey your staff, participants, whoever beforehand. And then, you know, you want to give like a 12-week sort of strategy plan. What's really interesting is that the turnaround with this stuff, the kind of the instant mindset shift that it can create, you can start to see almost instantaneous results, which I know sounds like a big, like that's big, but it's fascinating to watch because once people kind of start to tap into perspective, especially, and how they can manage it, they start to dive into their own power in terms of choice and where they're going to invest their time and their energy and where they're not. Yeah. It's fascinating. So that's sort of the qualitative type measures that you can really start to look at.
Yeah. I mean, that's so fascinating to tie something that I think most people would come in thinking is pretty ethereal. In fact, I would bet a lot of people would come into this going, corporate, really? You're pitching this to corporate? Like, where the bottom line? Where's the bottom line? But you've connected the output directly to the bottom line. We talk about sick days and mental health leave and productivity, and corporations are looking very, very carefully at this and managing it very carefully. So well done. That, to me, I feel like that's the key to any marketing success is to find the connection between your secret sauce, the thing that you think you do better than anyone else, and the core things that any entity is really worried about at the end of the day.
Right.
And that's brilliant. Good. That's great stuff.
Thanks. Well, and it's not BS. It's empirical. Like the evidence is out there. The research is all there. Right. Yeah. So it's great. I'm like, thanks, science.
Yeah. But that's thanks, science. That's great. But that's the secret. Like if anything, even for folks who aren't specifically in this space, what a great learning that is to do the work to connect the dots between what it is you do and the things that are important, especially for anyone who's going to be in the corporate space, because a lot of people feel like soft skills selling to corporate is tough, but not if you can connect those dots. That's really smart.
Well, and again, like we see the epidemic with mental health.
Sure.
And so, you know, when you can start to speak to that and again, you do need to do the research. You want to go in there with the hard facts and really understand what it is you're pitching and recognize too, you know, who are you teaching to? And make sure that you're not just giving them your opinion. It needs to be evidence-based. I am all for storytelling and sharing, especially, you know, in certain spaces, there's so much healing and empowerment that can happen in that. Right. At the same time, not everybody's going to relate to that. And so especially in the corporate world, you need to tie that also into the research and the foundation, because that's how these companies are there to make money.
Yeah. That's fundamentally, you've tapped into the decision-making process. And whether we like it or not, that's kind of how it comes down. So that's great work. We are out of time, and I apologize. I'd love to continue talking about this topic, but before we go, one last question for you. So those people who are listening, they feel either spoken to by what you're talking about, or they're in similar areas and would love to connect with you, what's a great way for folks to reach out and basically connect for the first time, get started in that process?
I mean, any social media platform at Mieka Forte. There's also on Instagram at the Many Sides of Happy. There's also my website, www.miekafort.com. And then I have a newsletter too. So if they want to sign up for that, there's information there.
All right. Well, we've got those links here below the video or the show notes page if you're on audio. If you're out and about listening to this, come on back to the show notes page. You can click on through to those links. Thank you so much, Mieka, for being with us today. It's been really insightful, and we don't get a lot of the soft skills plus the corporate quantitative think, which is kind of my secret love of entrepreneurism. So it's great that we get to talk about this. Thanks so much for shedding light on that for us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for being here with us on this episode of the 6 to 7 Figure Show. I've been your host, Frank Bria. And look, the big learning here is got to be connect the dots. If you feel like you've got some kind of a soft skill and you're working with folks to create transformational change, find a way to connect the dots to the thing that they really care about. And if you're working in corporate, you got to go to the bottom line. There's just no other way around it, but there are great ways to do it. And Mieka's found a terrific formula for that. So use that as an example. Thanks again for being here. I know you got a lot of things to do. If you're spending time with us, we really appreciate it. And we'll see you on our next episode. All right, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.